In late June 1943, 60 Avro Lancaster bombers left England heading for a target deep inside southern Germany. To achieve their aim, the large formation of heavy bombers would have to fly 800 miles over enemy territory in total darkness to destroy a target that was critical to Germany's war effort. With the short summer nights, however, they would not be able to return to England. In the 1930s, Germany was operating a fleet of airships, and the Zeppelin Company's largest airships, the Graf Zeppelin, the Graf Zeppelin II and the ill-fated Hindenburg, were housed and operated from an airfield in southern Germany. On the shore of Lake Constance, close to where Germany borders with Austria and Switzerland, sat the Friedrichshafen-Lowenthal airfield, now Friedrichshafen Airport, and it was here that these giants of the sky were housed in large sheds. One such Zeppelin shed, which measured 300 metres long by 55 metres wide, with a height of 60 metres, was built specifically for the largest of the Zeppelin fleet, and had become redundant in 1940. The Hindenburg had been lost in the dreadful fire disaster in 1937 in New Jersey, and the two sister Graf Zeppelins had been taken out of service and scrapped. By early 1943, it had been dismantled and relocated 3 kilometres away to an industrial area on the outskirts of nearby Friedrichshafen. In June of 1943, a British RAF de Havilland Mosquito of No. 540 Squadron was on a routine aerial reconnaissance mission over the Lake Constance area, and having taken photographs of the industrial complex at Friedrichshafen, they were sent for analysis. Sitting in the Chiltern Hills in Medmenham in Buckinghamshire is Danesfield House, a large pseudo-Tudor mansion. It had been requisitioned by the Air Ministry and was home to the Joint Service Imagery Intelligence Unit, and known as RAF Medmenham. Head of G-Section, Radar and Radio, Squadron Leader Claude Wavell was analysing the recently acquired photographs from Friedrichshafen when something caught his eye. The former Zeppelin shed was easily identified, but lying just outside of it were stacks of ribbed metalwork, which looked familiar to him. Referring back to earlier reconnaissance photographs of the same location, showed that these stacks were constantly changing, indicating recent activity at the site. These items of ribbed metalwork were quickly identified as the lattice reflector dishes of the giant Würzburg radar sets, the Würzburg Riese. The Würzburg radar system had been known about since December of 1941, when a photographic reconnaissance Spitfire flown by Flight Lieutenant Tony Hill identified a smaller version of the Würzburg on a Normandy clifftop. The resultant smash and grab raid by C Company of the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, known as Operation Biting, the Brunval raid, managed to steal this radar, and as a result much was learned about German radar technology. The Würzburg Riese was a significant improvement from the earlier version in that, although still operating at the same frequency of 560 MHz, its larger dish and higher power gave it more accuracy and longer range. The head of all radar matters at RAF Medmenham was Assistant Director of Intelligence Dr. Reginald Victor Jones. Jones had been studying the Würzburg radar system ever since it had been discovered, and by now he had a detailed knowledge of the German air defences. Realising the importance of the discovery of what appeared to be a manufacturing facility for the giant Würzburg, Jones took this information to Lord Cherwell, Professor Frederick Lindemann, who was the chief scientific advisor to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill, as a result, visited Medmenham to view the images for himself. It was swiftly agreed that this manufacturing facility should be destroyed, and so Operation Bellicose was ordered. At this point of the war, RAF Bomber Command was undergoing the Battle of the Ruhr, which was a campaign against the industrial complexes of northwest Germany. The relative proximity of the targets to England meant that the bombing raids could be carried out despite the short hours of darkness due to the time of year. It also meant that they could make good use of the Mosquito Pathfinder Force of No. 8 Group. The high-altitude Mosquito Pathfinders used the Oboe radar ranging device, which had been proven to provide good accuracy for the main bomber formations, although it was limited in range due to the curvature of the Earth, and couldn't be used beyond 280 miles, or 450 kilometres, from England. The Battle of the Ruhr had been going on since March of 1943, And now, some 3 months into the campaign, RAF Bomber Command Chief Arthur Harris was concerned that due to the relentless nature of targeting a specific region, Germany's defences were being concentrated in these areas, making the raids more difficult and incurring higher losses. Harris had been under an Air Staff order to give high priority to targets linked with the German fighter force, and this was known as the Point Blank Directive, and would be operated along with the Americans. Airframe and aircraft factories would be targeted by the 8th United States Army Air Force, and aircraft component factories and other associated industries would be targeted by the RAF. The Würzburg facility in Friedrichshafen therefore fell perfectly into this category for the RAF. The aircraft chosen for the raid was the Avro Lancaster, but there was a problem in the planning. By the best tactical route, the distance from England to the target would be some 800 miles. An RAF bomber force of Lancasters simply cannot fly that distance and return to base whilst under the cover of darkness in mid-summer. The solution was to be found to the south. The United States Army Air Force had 2 bases in Algeria on the North African coast, one at Blida and the other at Maison Blanche. These bases were within the range of the Lancaster, and the Americans agreed to receive the bomber force following the raid. Harris was also under the instruction to attack Italian targets whenever the opportunity arose, in an effort to knock the Italians out of the war, and so, although the Americans were not able to service the Lancasters, they would be refuelled and rearmed. On the return leg to England, it was decided to attack the Italian naval base at La Spezia, northwest Italy. The operation was to be carried out by No. 5 Group under the command of Air Vice Marshal the Honourable Ralph Cochrane. No. 5 Group had been the first to be equipped with the Avro Lancaster, and had acquired a reputation for daring low-level attacks, such as the Augsburg raid of the 17th of April 1942. Leading the raid would be Group Captain Leonard Slee, with Wing Commander Cosme Lockwood Gom of No. 467 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, as deputy. No. 8 Group, under the command of Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, would supply a small group of Lancasters to act as pathfinders. Because this operation substantially exceeded the range of the Mosquito Pathfinders and their Oboe radar ranging system, a certain amount of tension mounted between Cochrane and Bennett, as Cochrane was unconvinced with the accuracy that could be provided by the Lancaster Pathfinders, and he was arguing to use his preferred method of delivery, which was a new technique known as time and distance bombing. This required the crews to choose 3 landmarks positioned in a straight line through to the target. The time interval between the first 2 landmarks would allow for calculation of true ground speed and wind drift. With this information, it could then be worked out the time elapsed from the 3rd landmark to the bomb release point. And because this attack was a timed run, the bombs would be dropped blind, with no need to visually acquire the target. This would be particularly useful if smoke from earlier bomb runs was obscuring the target. A compromise between Cochrane and Bennett was reached, and it was agreed that the Pathfinders of No. 8 Group would mark and remark the target throughout the raid, and the main bomber formation of No. 5 Group would bomb onto the marked targets. This plan would only change if it was deemed by the raid controller that the markers were either off target or obscured in any way, in which case the bombing formation would revert to time and distance bombing, using the features of the Lake Constance shoreline as waypoints. Wednesday the 16th of June, and 4 Pathfinder crews of 97 Squadron boarded their Lancasters at RAF Bourne in Cambridgeshire, and flew the short distance to RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. They were not given any information about the impending raid, only to take a week's worth of kit. The 4 pilots chosen for Operation Bellicose were Flight Lieutenant Rod Rodley, DFC. He was on his 2nd tour with 97 Squadron, and he flew on the Augsburg raid. Flight Lieutenant Johnny Sauvage, DFC, a French volunteer who had flown previously on Handley Page Hamden's of 44 Squadron. Pilot Officer Jonah Jones and Pilot Officer Jimmy Munro of the Royal Canadian Air Force were on their first tour with 97 Squadron, but had already shown themselves to be highly skillful pilots, and had already been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. That Wednesday afternoon, they received a limited briefing. The target is of special importance and housed in a Zeppelin shed and its immediate surrounds. They were to provide target indication for a group of 56 Lancasters from No. 5 Group. Accuracy is of the highest order. The Pathfinder plan was for Jones and Munro to arrive in their aircraft ahead and at a higher altitude than that of Rodley and Savage. Following a timed run across Lake Constance and crossing the shoreline of Friedrichshafen, they would begin dropping flares. These flares would assist Rodley and Savage to pick out the Zeppelin shed, following which they would drop target indicator bombs onto the shed. The target indicators would be dropped alternately red and green. The Pathfinder crews could then radio to the main force to bomb red or green accordingly, depending on where they landed. The following morning, Group Captain Slee briefed the entire operations crews. The Pathfinders and the main bombing force now knew the full details of the target, and were now especially surprised to learn that they will be heading to North Africa, not returning to England, in readiness for another target on the return home, although this target was as yet undisclosed. On the evening of Sunday, 20th of June, under radio silence, the Pathfinder Lancasters began their takeoff roll and climbed off the grass of the Scampton runway at 9:45 p.m. And as the Pathfinders were taken to the air, so were No. 5 Group Lancasters from neighbouring bases, and they all formed a loose formation. Their route took them out to the west of London, before turning south at Reading in Berkshire, for the waypoint of Selsey Bill on the Sussex coast. The air defences at Normandy were of concern, so the formation circled around Selsey Bill to allow for the light to fade further, but also to gain as much altitude as possible. As the formation was approaching the French coast, they entered a belt of thunderstorms. This wasn't too much of a problem, but for the master bomber containing Group Captain Slee. As much as he was the operation commander, he wasn't an operational pilot, and he was sitting in the flight engineer's seat. This aircraft was skippered by squadron leader Jerry Falk. With the worsening storm, Falk decided to lose some height in an attempt to get under the storm. Unfortunately for him and his aircraft, the German air defences spotted him and opened up with a barrage of flak. Falk carried out evasive manoeuvres, turning left and turning right, climbing, descending to try and escape the flak, and eventually he did just that. It was a close call. Having escaped the storm and now over France, they turned southeast, descending to 10,000 feet in doing so until they reached Orléans, where they turned due east and headed straight for Germany, descending further to 3,000 feet. When the formation was 45 minutes from the target, Falk's Lancaster began emitting sparks from the port side inboard engine. The flak over Normandy had been more problematic than it had first seemed. He promptly shut it down and feathered the prop. This would cause a problem though, as the port side inboard engine provided the compressed air for the Lancaster's Mark 14 bombsight mechanical computer. He therefore unfeathered the prop to re-enable the engine to turn, but it was too damaged for this to happen, and it caught fire. He jettisoned his bomb load and dived to starboard, and headed into Swiss airspace in case the aircraft had to be abandoned. Fortunately, the fire extinguishers and the dive put out the fire. Group Captain Slee now reluctantly broke radio silence and handed over command of the operation to Wing Commander Gom. Meanwhile, the Pathfinders were arriving at the target area. Munro in his Lancaster, from the headland of Constance, could see that the town of Friedrichshafen was dark and quiet as he made his way across Lake Constance. He crossed ashore at 12,000 feet and ordered his bomb aimer, Sergeant Eric Siswain, to begin letting go his flares. As he did so, he looked out to the left and was amazed to see Jones's Lancaster laying out a string of flares also in the darkness. Rodley and Savage lined up their Lancasters between the flares, and in the glow, they picked out the Zeppelin shed. Now that the target area was lit up, the German air defences realised they were under attack and opened up in response. 25 searchlights, 16 to 20 heavy and 18 to 20 light flak guns within an 8-mile radius were seeking out the approaching Lancasters. With his aircraft bouncing around and the sound of shrapnel rattling the aircraft's skin, Munro was still able to release his flares. But as he did so, he found perhaps a dozen searchlights lock onto his aircraft. He made a series of diving turns and was able to escape by dropping to just 700 feet above the ground. The main bomber formation was approaching at 10,000 feet, and having seen the amount of defences now in full operation, Gom ordered the whole force to climb another 5,000 feet. Rodley and Savage, however, were already over the target at 12,000 feet, and had to run the gauntlet of flak. The chaos of the air defences meant that the delivery of the target indicator bombs was not as precise as had been hoped for. Because Rodley and Savage's aircraft were varying their height and course to avoid the air defences, not all of their bombs hit the targets. At the head of the main bomber force, Gom was now having doubts as to the accuracy of the Pathfinders, and he ordered the first wave following up to bomb visually. As the wave of Lancasters began their bombing run, Munro and his Pathfinder aircraft came round for another pass, dropping his remaining flares as well as 8 high-explosive 500-pound bombs. These were visually confirmed to hit the target. And in another Pathfinder, Jones was able to complete 4 more passes until the shockwaves from the main force's payload was proven just too dangerous. Savage's Pathfinder was also on a 4th run when it was hit by flak and suffered hydraulic damage, causing one of its main undercarriage legs to descend. By now, the target area was shrouded in dust and smoke, and so Gom gave the order for the remaining Lancasters to make their bomb runs using the time and distance method and using predetermined reference waypoints on the shoreline of Lake Constance. By 2 AM, some 13 minutes after the first Pathfinder had arrived, it was over. The main force had left the area, leaving just the master bomber and the Pathfinders to turn southeast and follow the formation in the direction of the Austrian Alps. Once over the 14,000-foot peaks, they turned south in the direction of the Italian lakes. The Lancasters did not encounter any Luftwaffe engagements during the bombing runs because the night fighter stations were mainly positioned out to the north and west. However, several Luftwaffe fighters were scrambled from Florennes and Juvincourt. These aircraft lay in wait, circling, expecting to see dozens of RAF heavy bombers making their escape back to England. Unfortunately for the Luftwaffe, the bombers were already halfway to Africa. With the sun rising over the Mediterranean Sea and the Lancasters flying again at low levels so as to avoid detection by the Luftwaffe's 2nd Night Fighter Wing, which was based in Italy, Johnny Savage from his cockpit window saw Rodley's aircraft just in front of him suddenly become engulfed in a red fireball. A red target indicator bomb had failed to leave the aircraft correctly and was still in the bomb bay in an armed condition. As the aircraft descended towards the sea, the barometric fuse ignited the red pyrotechnic candles. Rodley quickly opened the bomb bay doors, and Savage and his crew looked on from behind and were relieved to see the bomb fall away. The bomber formation was now approaching the Algerian coast in safety, except there was one more challenge to overcome. Blida Airfield was shrouded in fog, and the airfield controller refused them permission to land. So, running perilously low on fuel, the entire formation headed for the alternate airfield at Maison Blanche. Savage had radioed to air traffic control that he had a damaged undercarriage leg, and fearing he would block the runway in a crash landing, he was instructed to wait until last. What must have seemed like an eternity in such a fuel-critical state, it was finally his turn. Lining up his Lancaster, he held a slight bank towards the good undercarriage leg, but as the weight of the Lancaster settled, the damaged leg collapsed, causing the aircraft to dig in and spin off the runway until it came to rest in a cloud of dust. The aircrew were unhurt. The first leg of Operation Bellicose was now complete. Of the 60 Lancasters that left England on the 20th of June, 52 were considered to be in a serviceable state and fit to fly home to England via La Spezia. Of the 4 Pathfinders, Rodley and Savage's crews would remain behind, leaving Munro and Jones with the task of marking the target at La Spezia. And on the 23rd of June at 7:40 PM, Munro lifted his Lancaster off the Algerian runway, soon followed by Jones and the remaining main bomber force. As they approached La Spezia in northwest Italy, the skies were clear, although a little hazy. Munro and Jones delivered their flares and target indicators, despite a smokescreen being put up by the Italian defences. The following bomber force soon after delivered their payloads, and although no impacts were visually confirmed, an enormous explosion was confirmed by the Pathfinders, which could well have been an oil storage facility being destroyed, along with an armament store. Following departure of the area, the bomber force again headed for low level for the journey across France, and just like the outbound journey, they went by undetected. At 4:09 on the morning of the 24th of June, Jones brought the first Lancaster home to RAF Scampton. Munro followed 3 minutes later, and soon after the entire group landed safely. With the exception of Sauvage's crash landing in Algeria, no aircraft had been lost during Operation Bellicose. The day after the attack on Friedrichshafen, a photo reconnaissance mosquito photographed the target area and sent the images to Medmenham for analysis. Although the roof of the Zeppelin shed appeared to be intact, the northern wall had been blown out, and the damage suggests that inside the shed, where the radar factory was located, would have been severely damaged. It was also subsequently discovered that along with the Würzburg radar parts, inside the Zeppelin shed was a V-2 rocket production line. Operation Bellicose had accidentally become the first Allied airstrike against the German V-weapons program. Also damaged had been nearby factories that produce engines and gearboxes for tanks. The mission had been deemed a partial success, with an estimate that only 9% of the bombs dropped actually hit their intended target. It was suggested that because the main force was ordered to climb a further 5,000 feet and into stronger winds, this threw off the bomb sights, which had been set for a lower release height. Casualties were relatively light considering the scale of the attack, with 44 people being killed on the ground and 1 in the air. So what was more accurate, Pathfinders or time and distance bombing? The argument between Cochrane and Bennett would continue. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and consider subscribing.